So, we're back at it this afternoon, and we've got a wonderful afternoon opportunity before us to address actually a number of things that are woven into the goals and objectives around the strategic goals and objectives we just discussed, particularly around how we prepare and support teachers in the profession to increase student achievement. We are going to start with, leave our general counsel, Ms. Schaefer, to kick it off, and then hear from Dr. Tomberlin and our superintendent special advisor, and then eventually to Dean Dempsey. We're at Pepsi. Welcome to Ms. Schaefer.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. See the board, the superintendent, and all of the guests here. I was asked to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the legal roles of Pepsi versus the state board when looking at the licensure recommendations that Pepsi has been working on. This matter is scheduled to come before the state board at its next meeting for consideration. And so I, as chairman, thought it would be helpful to have a little bit of a primer of exactly what is coming before you and or what you would like to see come before you. So the rest of the panel will talk about the substance. I'm talking about the law. So we are going to go to, first is what Pepsi's role is legally. And I'm going to go pretty fast with these slides, so if you could just, because I can't see the bound. So, okay. All right. So Pepsi was created by the General Assembly in 2017. Professional Educator Preparation Standards Commission is the full name. The statutory purpose of Pepsi is to involve stakeholders in establishing high standards for educators. That's the statutory purpose. The role, Pepsi has several roles. But the main one is to make rule recommendations regarding all aspects of preparation, licensure, continuing education, and standards of conduct for professional educators. So rule recommendations come first from Pepsi to the state board, and then they're considered there. The commission is located administratively under the State Board of Education, but it exercises its powers independently from the state board. The Pepsi members, there are two standing members, the state superintendent, the state teacher of the year, and then 16 other members are appointed by the General Assembly, half by the House, half by the Senate. They are supposed to be professionals who come from the principal positions, the personnel administrators, college deans, educator prep programs, and even a member of the State Advisory Council of Indian Education. So it's very specifically prescribed who those folks are. The powers and duties are spelled out in the statutes, and there are three of them. First, the duties of Pepsi is to develop and recommend to the state board education rules related to all aspects of the educator preparation program. So educator preparation programs, that comes first to Pepsi and then to the state board with recommendations. The second one is to develop and recommend rules related to all aspects of professional standards for North Carolina educators. Again, these are rules that have to go through the rulemaking process the board adopts. The third one is a broader one, which says provide recommendations as requested to the State Board of Education related to educator preparation programs and professional standards for North Carolina educators. That's the, and so what we have now is the request from Pepsi to Pepsi by the state board chair. We'll talk about in a minute, but this item number 3 is where we are right now with the recommendations coming to revise the licensure programs, because we're not at the rule stage yet. We'll talk about that a little way in a little bit. And then the commission is also required to recommend ways to ensure that clinical practice, i.e. internship, student teaching, are effective programs. The way it works is Pepsi submits its recommendations under subsection A and then to the state board. And this is what the law says. So the state board shall adopt or reject rules recommendations and may not make any substantive changes to rules recommendations that it adopts. But again, under that item number 3, recommendations that are different than rules that are requested by the state board do not follow that same rule. And then if the state board rejects the rules recommendation, it has to say exactly why it rejects them. And then it goes back to the rules, to Pepsi for consideration. And then the state board, it comes back to the state board, and if the state board still isn't satisfied, it can make its own rules. So that is for rules recommendations. Rules are the things that go through the policymaking process and then go through the administrative rulemaking process. Okay, so we're going to talk just a minute about standard for rules, and I'm going through this really quickly because this is background, and the most important stuff is coming from the substantive folks. The standards for rule adoptions is set out in 150B, which is about rulemaking. And it says that agencies may not adopt a rule if it does one of the following. And item number 1 is the one I want you to focus on. It has to can't implement or interpret a law unless that law specifically authorizes the agency to do so. So the basis for rulemaking comes from legislation, and it says what powers and authorities are given to the agency, which is the state board. And so it has to be authorized in a rule in order for us to authorized in statute in order for us to make a rule. So as indicated on February 4 of 2021 at the state board meeting, there was a presentation from members of the Human Capital Roundtable, and that is a group that's made up mostly of educators in North Carolina, and it was a proposal to revise requirements for training, retention, and licensing of teachers. And following that, the state board chair requested that Pepsi study and make recommendations to the state board on how best to implement the recommended model. So that is the guidance that was given to Pepsi. So where are we now? We are looking at first needing to revise the statutes that are there. The current statutes say specifically that there are certain types of teacher licensures. They're called residency. There's a residency license. There's a continuing license. There's other kinds of licenses, emergency licenses. Those are in statute now. In order to look, if you look at the the PowerPoints that have come through the state board from Pepsi, those are they're different than those things now. So in order to be able to implement this plan, we're going to need to have the statute changed. Another one that is in the statute is that it's currently required that teachers achieve certain scores on license exams. And that's different from what Pepsi wants to recommend and/or the state board to adopt. Then we need to get the statute changed. So again, there are very specific things in the state statute, and many of those things are inconsistent with what is looking like it's going to come out of Pepsi based on the information that has been presented. Again, we can only adopt rules that are allowed to us in statute, and then we need to change the rules. We need to change the statute first. So the next step in developing a new licensure system would be for Pepsi to recommend and the state board to approve a request for regulatory changes that allow it to develop such a system or plan. So what the task is today is for the state board folks to start thinking about what it is that the board thinks need to be included in statutory requests to the General Assembly. The General Assembly is coming back in January, and I know the superintendent is anxious for us to get information to the board and to the General Assembly so that if we're going to make progress on this, we can do it in this biennium of the General Assembly. That is all I have to say. I will sit down unless anyone has any questions. Sorry for talking fast, but I didn't want to.
So, Ms. Shaver, just to clarify, so there's a lot of your presentation dealt with the rule recommendations. And I believe I heard you say that we're not at that stage yet.
Correct.
We're actually interacting with Pepsi under item 3, which gives us much more flexibility in interacting with Pepsi than with rulemaking procedure. Is that
correct? The rulemaking procedure, you can only adopt rules that are enforceable and usable through the administrative rule process. We have now an administrative rule that is and a state board policy that is consistent with the law, what the law says now. And in order to change that and have the authority to do what some of the things Pepsi is recommending, we would have to get statutory changes. So,
any other questions or clarifications?
Clarifications, Chairman, but before any rules can be changed, we have to view the document that's coming forward.
Well, I guess the question is what you want to ask the General Assembly to do.
Okay.
Do you want them to implement that whole document, which includes very specific requests for very specific amounts of money? Or is it something more general that goes to the General Assembly for a request that is more big ticket items? Because if you implement too much detail, then it's inflexible in the statute, and the state board doesn't have any flexibility. And right now, what's happening, and Dr. Chamberlain and I talk all the time, sometimes there's not enough flexibility in the way the current statutes are written, so that's something you need to think about as you think about what you're going to request. So that the state board and DPI doesn't have the ability to interpret those in ways that are flexible. Does that make sense?
Dr. Osmond?
Yes, thank you so much. Ms. Schaefer, I guess my question has to do with a little bit of the process. So the state board would need to make a request to have the statute changed, but would that also entail making that request and also having something to present by way of a plan?
Yes.
Or making the request and then go back and plan?
The plan can inform the request, but the question is what you're going to ask the General Assembly to do. I think that's the question today, is are you going to ask that this plan be adopted, or are you going to ask for the statutes to be changed so that the plan can be adopted?
The assumption, though, is that the plan, there is a plan.
I don't know exactly what Pepsi's going to present at this point, but I think the question is what it is the state board needs in order to move forward with getting the statute changed, in order to be able to get a plan implemented. The General Assembly can do whatever it wants to do. It can choose to ignore the request. It can choose to change any of the requests. And to finalize a plan, we would need to know what the General Assembly has in fact authorized. And then there's some things outside of the plan, like a pilot program. Is that's something I've heard discussed here and there? Is that something that you would want the General Assembly to authorize a pilot program to begin the implementation of this plan? So there are other things outside of what has actually been in the PowerPoints that have come before the state board. But again, you might want to consider how specific the request you want to go to the General Assembly need to be.
Yeah, I think Dr. Oxendine asked the most germane questions about what the process is. And given how complex and far-reaching this topic is, I think we're trying to take a measured approach of listening to the chair of Pepsi this afternoon, giving us time to think about what we hear in the process in terms of how close to a plan are we, and what other questions we might have and clarifications, and then eventually receive the formal recommendation. So
That's correct.
it's a bit fluid, this thing.
Yes, and again, you can't adopt a plan officially as the plan you're going to implement without the statutes changed. All right, thank you.
Dean, I think you're next. Yes, next door. For those of you who don't know, this is Dean Van Dempsey, Dean of the College of Education at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and one of our great partners. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
That's a bad sign to start the presentation. Get a cap on the bottom. Good afternoon. Let me start by saying it is an honor to be here and be part of this work. It's an honor to be here as the chair of Pepsi. Happy to represent the folks down at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I just, before I came here, stopped off at DC Virga, our laboratory school that we operate at UNC Wilmington. About 28 educators and staff, 200 children up on the north side in Wilmington. And every time I think about the Pepsi work and the recommendations and where we are headed, I think about what does it mean for those 200 children at DC Virga? What does it mean for the faculty and the staff? What does it mean for the parents and the communities? And how do we do the best work we can do at Pepsi to do our part to get this right? I want to thank Aaron, where's Aaron? The vice chair of Pepsi is sitting right over there. He thinks that's far enough away that I can't call him up to answer. As long as they're in the room, yeah, I do it. But thank you, Aaron, for your work and leadership. I want to definitely thank Patrick Miller, the previous chair of Pepsi. Patrick was the initial chair. He helped to sort of frame how do we do our work and what is this process. As you just saw in statute, what does that look like? And Patrick is a wonderful colleague and a great educator and not doing a very good job at being retired, I might add. I also want to thank all the subcommittee members. I know there's some in the room and on the board. The subcommittee work that has been done over the last 21 months now to get to the point where we can talk about the work today in the way that I'm going to frame it for this particular conversation. And I finally want to thank my colleagues and Pepsi's colleagues at the Department of Public Instruction, Tom Tomlin, Andrew Seiberg, and Kim Evans. They are great partners. They are great staff members in terms of their responsibility to the department and the support they provide to Pepsi. Every time we have a conversation, I cannot be more impressed with the sense of professionalism, the sense of collegiality, and their support that they provide to the work that we're doing through Pepsi. So I'm going to thank all of those people. What I'm going to share today is, if you go to the next slide, it is a synthesis of the draft that is before Pepsi. So you would have seen in the last two Pepsi meetings, the working document that we review in Pepsi. In Pepsi, we have feedback from previous meetings. We have feedback that we go back to co-chairs if we have questions about a particular element of the draft, and we incorporate that into the draft. It gets revised between the Pepsi meetings, so sometime early next week, we'll see what would then be the current version based on latest revisions. So that is the working document before Pepsi. What I'm going to share is an attempt to synthesize that in a framework that lays out the basic components and the basic architecture of what is in that plan to try to get at those critical structural elements. I do want to highlight, these are a few things I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to reiterate the powers and duties of Pepsi that Ms. Schaefer just shared. That presentation and conversation has been really important to me as chair of Pepsi and understanding the path and understanding the work we're doing and what our responsibility and with the State Board of Education and our opportunity with the State Board of Education. Why North Carolina needs to do this work. I want to talk about the current architecture of teaching in North Carolina and how that makes this work critical and important. I'll share a note with you from a personal point of view, and then I'm going to talk about the design elements for the profession that are in the draft framework under Pepsi's review right now, and then the blueprint for action as I see it based on this synthesis of the work that has been done over the last 20 months. And I remember enough about my time as a social studies teacher that I've just given you the anticipatory set. Work that we're about to do. Because simple.
Madeline Hunter.
I'm not old enough to know who Madeline Hunter is. That is Madeline Hunter. You're exactly right. So let me talk about the powers and duties of Pepsi. Just to reiterate, we are focused in our work right now with this initiative around number 3, provide recommendations as requested to the State Board of Education related to the educator preparation programs and professional standards of North Carolina educators. This is different from most of what we have been doing in Pepsi during Pepsi's existence. In Pepsi, much of our work is we're looking at existing policy. So we're looking at a condition that existed and existed policy to update it, to revise it based on current needs of the profession as the state board has articulated that to us, or comes from the General Assembly through the state board. Most of what we have done has been in 1 and 2. This is solidly grounded in number 3. And so we're operating under the state board's request to us to provide recommendations relative to the pathways to excellence for North Carolina. So we could go to the next slide. Basically, what Pepsi is doing in language that has been helpful to me is providing the recommendations as requested on the professional pathways model, and to approach that work as architecture and blueprint. My background is not in architecture. I have an associate dean who luckily for me does have a background in architecture. So she's been able to help with the way the language can work for us with Pepsi. But our primary responsibility and what you're going to see in this synthesis is around the sense of architecture and blueprint. How do we start to move toward constructing the profession and sustaining the profession that we want in North Carolina? That is what is defined by us in Section 3 that I just shared. Also want to share a critical point about how I see my role as the chair of Pepsi and the person representing Pepsi today. I believe, as an educator, as a citizen of the state of North Carolina, as a dean, that a central and unique role of the State Board of Education is to serve as stewards of a covenant for the profession between the people who work in the profession and the people of North Carolina. Professions, regardless of what they are, engineering, law, medicine, whatever the profession is, works in a covenant. And there is a body and there is a structure that says to the people impacted by the work and the services of the profession that it has integrity as it comes to those people. In our case, as educators come to children that we educate and their families and their communities. The state board's responsibility in that space is a steward of the relationships. And I highly respect that role in terms of the covenants that are important to what we call professions and what we call the education profession. So why does North Carolina need to do this work? The fundamental reason North Carolina needs to do this work is to create, support, and sustain pathways to excellence for teaching professionals. That phrase has stuck with me through this entire process. What we are building is pathways to excellence for teaching professionals. And I think it is really important that we hold that at least as an aspirational goal if we're not there, and we are obviously not there yet. We're building this work, but we keep that out in front of us. It is a pathway to excellence. Now, what are the reasons behind not being where we need to be as a profession, and what might we have to, where might our focus be on building that pathway? Well, there are stresses and fractures in the lack of coherency in the current system, and we have seen that play out in the Pepsi work over Pepsi's existence. And I'll share a few of what those stresses and fractures and incoherent points are. One, the knowledge base of the profession has become detached from the professionals who create it and live in it every day. We've seen over time, this has been going on for decades. The architecture of the work, the knowledge base has been detached from the people who work in classrooms, and where that knowledge base is constructed in its most important ways. And those things have become separated. What we call the knowledge base and the work that goes on in classrooms. Been going on for decades, been going on across the country, has been going on internationally. Second, the lack of an architecture for educator salaries and compensation, leaving an unpredictable process of annual salary actions. We now live in the what's going to happen this year, what's the goal this year, what might happen for this subset of the educators this year. And we moved away from an architecture that can be reasonably predictable to where a person can see what their compensation opportunities might be over a career. And that is unpredictable. The next, licensure elements and expectations created to ensure learning success have become frayed and patchwork. That's actually been too much a part of the work of Pepsi. We're seeing problems with enough people in a particular licensure area, but we're having people coming out, but they're missing a particular test. They haven't cleared a particular component of their license. We got to give those people more time to clear that license so they can stay in classrooms, so we don't lose those people from the profession. And we've done that in multiple iterations, and that is creating that fray. So whatever structure we thought we had, we're dismantling to respond to that crisis or to that critical need, not have intention about how to build the profession the way we want to build it. We lack in North Carolina a structure with role-defined professional status as a teacher's career advances. We're piloting some good work in North Carolina, but we need to build that in as part of the infrastructure, as you'll see in a few minutes with some of the later points. We are in a highly fragmented state. for the teaching profession. We're seeing, as I'll say in a second, we're seeing parts of the profession pull apart, move away from each other. The coherency and the complementarity of different components of the profession relative to each other is not as clear and not as strong as it used to be. And I'll add as the last point, the erosion from decades of demoralization in the profession, for the profession, coupled with the impact of the pandemic and negative pressures on teaching. This has not been caused by the pandemic. This has been made more clear about the pandemic. Concerns and stresses and fractures that were there before the pandemic have become heightened as a result of the pandemic. But this has been a problem for the teaching profession since the 1980s. We've seen this erosion of what it means to be a teacher, what the profession means, and we're seeing the results of that. How's that? Okay. So let me say one other, I noticed the chair of Pepsi as the dean of the College of Education down at UNC Wilmington, the Watson College of Education. As an educator, a person who's engaged in that, my entire career has been in education and as a citizen of the state of North Carolina. I want to say this clearly and confidently. I fundamentally believe this is the best opportunity North Carolina has had in decades to transform the teaching profession in compelling and positive ways. I fundamentally believe that. I believe that in my core, that this is that opportunity. It's the best opportunity that North Carolina has had in decades. The second, the context in which educators work, whether that's the classroom, the school, or the community. The context of teacher practice, student learning, and teacher learning, and compelling evidence that it happens. Compelling evidence that student learning, teacher learning, and teacher practice is occurring in positive ways. Is the architectural foundation for teaching as a profession. That is the core. That is one of the foundations. And finally, the essential purpose of the analysis of practice and its impact on student learning is to situate the knowledge in practice. You cannot understand the effectiveness of teacher practice when it leads to positive outcomes in student learning without situating that in the practice of teachers, in classrooms, in schools, and in the interactions they have with the broader community. That is why we do analysis of practice. That is fundamentally why we want to understand the positive impact that happens in student learning and then how that is used as part of the professional knowledge base in the teaching profession. So let me talk a little bit about the current architecture, what I call tensions and juxtapositions that are in that architecture that are sort of driving and causing some of the problems I mentioned earlier. And these are tensions and juxtapositions that have emerged in the Pepsi work. These have emerged in the subcommittee. So I've pulled these out of the conversations of which I'm aware from preparation and entry, which is the subcommittee I co-chair with Hank Weddington, but also the other subcommittee notes and conversations that happened in the 3 other subcommittees. So in the current architecture, these are those tensions. We have a profession that's built on multiple autonomous, semi-autonomous, and sometimes competing entities. We've got different spaces in the education profession in North Carolina that have differing levels of autonomy depending on what they do. And that causes a lack of clarity and a lack of coherency. And sometimes they compete with each other. Universities compete with other universities for students. Universities are in a space where there's tension with community colleges about what is the appropriate role of community colleges relative to the role of 4-year colleges and universities in the preparation and licensure of teachers. That's an example of that tension. The knowledge base of the profession sits across multiple partners and stakeholders that can operate in silos. We talk about that a lot in higher education, how higher ed operates in silos. That's been true my entire career. Higher ed operates in silos, but we're seeing silos in other components of the education profession and in the space in which educators work. The next one. The need for schools and districts to be able to employ educators at widely varying levels of professional knowledge, skills, and experience. We know that to the point that I would say we could call it a fact. schools and districts are in a situation where they have to employ educators who are at widely varying levels of professional knowledge, skill, and experience. That is where we are. That is juxtaposed to the belief that professionals should not enter the profession with full responsibilities without having met expectations for established standards of practice. Those two things have been clear in the subcommittee work, and there is a tension there because you cannot do the two simultaneously. And we have to figure out how to resolve the tension between those two important value statements and needs of the education profession right now. The next, the need to provide teachers at these varying levels with critical and substantive professional supports in a situation where we lack those supports. We do not have enough of those supports given the number of teachers who are currently employed in those varying and widely ranging levels of professional knowledge. And that structure is necessary if we're going to have that range of professional knowledge in the profession, and we currently have that range. The effectiveness of the professional knowledge base manifested in EPPs, what we do down at the Watson College and the university, as evidenced in P12 student learning outcomes. We know from the conversations and what we reviewed at the Pepsi subcommittees that people who complete EPP-based educator preparation programs have the most positive impact on student learning. That's what the data tells us. And wouldn't we want educators to come through that experience? Don't we want them to have access to that knowledge base to become educators if we know it's that effective? But attention in this work has been the accessibility of that knowledge base. Do people who want to become teachers at varying points in their lives, whether it's traditional 18, 19-year-old college students or career changers, can they access that knowledge base? Do they have the flexibility they need to be able to access that knowledge base? Next, the applied knowledge base situated in practice, classrooms, schools, and communities creates a tension. To learn that knowledge base that is situated in practice, you have to be situated in practice. There's no, in my professional perspective, there is no such thing as becoming a teacher in the abstract. I taught them, but they didn't learn anything. There's no such thing as learning to teach in the abstract. Learning to teach is situated in practice. That does not mean everything happens in practice, but it means the knowledge base of teaching is a knowledge base that is situated in practice, and that is critical to the structure of the profession. Moving from where we are to where we need to be requires that we rethink this set of things: recruiting, preparation, licensure, support and retention, and compensation. I've received several questions. Pepsi has received several questions saying concern we should just focus on compensation. We should just focus on licensure. We should just focus on one part of this. We cannot build the pathway that we need to excellence if we don't focus on all of the components of the structure and the structure itself. And we have to move from isolating these issues into thinking about these issues as coherently connected components of a profession for the teaching profession in North Carolina. We have to do that in an architecture that balances and supports all of these simultaneously. We are supporting each one, and they also balance and support each other. There's a clear connection across how we structure and do the work of these different elements in the teaching profession in North Carolina. So I want to share now a few design elements for thinking about teaching as a profession. So and I'll be happy to come back and answer questions. The set of tensions and juxtapositions that have emerged in the Pepsi work, I'm going to talk just a few minutes about design elements for the profession. These are design elements for professions, but I'm going to use language that situates them specifically in the teaching profession. So to spend a few minutes sharing these. 1, professional knowledge base and practice built on and informed by the complexity of practice, cultivated and developed in practice. That is a critical element of the teaching profession. I want to reinforce complexity of practice. Teaching is a complex practice. Teaching is complex. It is challenging. It is intellectually rigorous. And you come to know it through a process that reflects that. Second, practice is assessed and analyzed to understand the impact on learner outcomes. That's why it's the fundamental reason we need to assess and analyze teacher practice, to understand the impact on student learning. That's the reason we need to do that. We need to moving professional knowledge through analysis and assessment of practice from tacit to explicit. From tacit to explicit knowledge to inform practice. We know from research that as teachers have more experience, over time they gain more experience and they move to more complex forms of practice. We know that. We also know that much of that knowledge base remains tacit. How does the teacher know the thing that they know how to do? And we can go in a classroom and see it, but we don't know how to articulate that for other people who need to learn it. So how does that translate into learning for new teachers and professional development for career teachers? It's engaging in the analysis of practice in classrooms and schools in North Carolina to understand that knowledge base that expert teachers use all the time, but doesn't get articulated in ways that we can transfer that knowledge base and share that knowledge base with other educators. The next element of the profession, increasing levels of teacher expertise established over time with the development of practice. Understanding that that is a component of the profession that happens. Teachers build that expertise over time as they engage in increasingly levels of complexity in their practice. Tied to the teacher expertise component is the increasing levels of teacher autonomy established over time with development of complexity and success of their practice. As teachers become more skilled and experienced in the practice in which they engage, they can move toward increasing levels of autonomy. That's almost intuitive in educator preparation. We know that first and second year students in the university can't do the things that fourth year students can do. They've not had that building complexity of practice. But that teacher autonomy component is critical, particularly in that tension I mentioned earlier. How much autonomy should a teacher have who goes into a classroom who has zero experience and zero preparation? That's a critical question. What is the appropriate level of autonomy for that teacher based on the expertise that teacher has attained? Next, well-resourced, practice-based, accessible structures for professional learning that can support and inform these three components of the profession: pre-service and new teachers, experienced and advanced teachers, and struggling teachers. By the way, we want to support struggling teachers to get better and keep them in the profession. The reason that we want to give accessibility to teachers who might be struggling in their practice is for them to become more successful so they stay in the profession. It is not to remove them from the profession. It is to help them become better in that third group. The next item, compensation and reward structures built on predictable, long-term, layered strategies, including licensure, experience levels of practice, professional learning, and how that intersects with impact. What do we know about student learning as a result of those things? But that compensation and reward structure that provides that kind of confidence and continuity for people who are in the profession. And then last, well-designed entry points with clarity on the purpose, the appropriate license, standards of practice, support given the level of autonomy, and salary and compensation that correlates with that entry point. And those entry points are in part structured by those elements that I talked about just a few minutes ago. So a blueprint for action. I'm sharing this as a synthesis. This is not language that where Pepsi has deliberated the language. I'm confident it represents the work that Pepsi has been doing and what's in the more detailed framework that's in the draft before Pepsi. But a blueprint for action, I'm going to share 10 of these and then I'll be done. 1, build a professional framework around articulated standards of practice. We've talked in the subcommittees about using InTask. We use that in North Carolina now. We use it intensively in educator preparation. Build a professional framework around articulated standards of practice with clear expectations for progression in attainment of the professional knowledge base. That standards of practice phrase is critical. What do we expect teachers to know and be able to do that has a positive impact on student learning? Number two, build analysis and assessment of practice from a base of multiple evidence points in practice, with responsible application as to how each informs practice. The assessment and analysis practice should be based on multiple evidence points. There is no single indicator that can tell us a good teacher is a good teacher or a bad teacher is a bad teacher. It's about multiple forms of evidence that inform practice. And I'll also add, as a dean and an educator or a person with a background in assessment, assessing anything from one data point is bad data and it's bad assessment. The data is only as good as the application you use the data for. And to assess anything from one point is bad assessment. You've got to have multiple constructs and evidence points that are built into that process. Number three, this is the blueprint for action. Create advanced and lead teacher roles to support teachers in various stages of professional learning, practice, and transition into and through the profession. That's tied to that range of knowledge that I talked about earlier, the multiple entry points, and then how you build that practice. We have to have advanced and lead teacher roles to do that. And we have to have them in sufficient numbers to do that. And they have to be in the places where we need them to do that. Number four, build licensure around evidence of attainment of the knowledge base of practice appropriate to the purpose of the license. An advanced license has a different purpose from an entry license. Build licensure around the evidence of what you need to know and be able to do at those different entry points and the purpose that license has. Number five, create and adopt valid and reliable tools to analyze and assess practice and its impact on student learning. Create and adopt valid and reliable tools to assess, to analyze and assess practice and its impact on student learning. A cornerstone of the professional knowledge base and the ability to make explicit the practices that positively impact student learning is the reason for doing this. The tools that we use to assess and analyze teacher practice need to be able to accomplish that. If they are not telling us something about the teacher's ability to positively impact student learning, then we need to question the tool or question the instrument, or we need to have a robust conversation about why we're using it, because that should be the purpose of those tools. Number six, build on existing assets in identified professional knowledge bases and structures that correlate to positive impact on teacher practice and student learning. And I will add to that, including the collaborative knowledge base that exists in EPPs and the partnerships between schools, districts, and higher education. We know the effectiveness of that knowledge base based on data that we have in North Carolina. It is an asset to this work, and we need to build on that asset and all of the existing assets that we have in the profession in the state. Number seven, develop new professional learning tools and structures that give flexibility in access to the professional knowledge base, evidence of having attained it, and evidence of applying it successfully in practice. We've talked about multiple professional learning tools that we can use in North Carolina that go beyond the traditional learning tools, or that can wrap around the traditional learning tools that we've used in the state. We need to build on the good ones that we have, and we need to develop new tools that can be made accessible to teachers and to people who want to become teachers, so they can be accessible in those pathways, or in the pathway. Action number 8, articulate clear distinctions across pathway entry points and progression, focused on successful entry into the profession and transition to fully autonomous professionals. We want to recruit more people who can come into the pathway with the accessibility they need to be able to be successful and ultimately become fully autonomous teachers. We want that funnel to be as wide as is professionally responsible, and we want every single one of them to build the knowledge base they need to become excellent and autonomous professionals. Number 9, build and fund a compensation and reward model that reflects the importance and value of the teaching profession and that attracts and retains people in the profession. And number 10, secure funding to support that infrastructure. supported funding to support, secure funding to support the infrastructure framework, as well as its discrete components. Each one of the components that Pepsi has been talking about is going to be, is connected to how North Carolina resources those components. Each one has to have integrity in terms of its resource base, but they have to have integrity as a structure. How do they hold together in a well-resourced structure that supports the teaching profession in North Carolina? Mr. Chair, I think that summarizes responsibly the work that we have been doing at Pepsi and where we are headed into the meeting next week. I'll be happy to entertain questions or points that people would like to raise when you're ready.
Thank you, Dean Nipsey. Dr. Beechmore, could you go back to the design elements? Actually, just the first of those, and because those slides in the blueprint, I think are already this. Open the floor for questions, comments from my colleagues. Thoughts from the advice? Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation, and I still remember Madeline Hunter.
Thank you.
No one else in the room, probably maybe three of us.
So do I.
Let me ask you this question. So what you have shared, especially the design elements, how does that translate into the models that we have previously seen? The PowerPoint models that have come our way. I mean, are these design elements located along that continuum?
I think you could, I think they could be mapped. I mean, you know, if I sat down with earlier language, or people on Pepsi sat down with earlier language from previous iterations of language, could those design elements be mapped to that? I'd say more than likely in part. One of the things as I wrote this language, I mean, you know, part of the challenge and I frankly enjoy doing it. Synthesizing 20 months of work across 4 subcommittees and hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of minutes and recordings and those kind of things. Can we capture all that in a way that can be articulated? I don't know how long that took, 20, 30 minutes, in a way that's reasonably coherent, that reflects what I have known over my time, having done work on what professions are. Were those elements in the work? And the answer to that was yes. When I looked at the subcommittee work and talked to the co-chairs through the process and Pepsi through the process, those design elements were there. We were talking about those critical components of how we define professions in general. I can't go back prior to any language that would be before the first presentation to the state board and that document that came to Pepsi as a result of that process. But I think you'd see, you could build bridges across the language. I feel pretty confident saying that. Constructs are simple.
And I have another question, if I may. Going back to the point about the multiple assessments in order to determine effectiveness. Those multiple assessments, my concern has been this. I would think that there would need to be some equal weighting of those assessments. Talk about that if you would. I mean, for instance, if we considered EVOS as an assessment, suppose we considered micro-credentials and others. How would we know that the weighting of those multiple measures are equivalent? Or, you know, I'm getting to the whole notion of equity.
Yeah, I'm speaking individually. You know, I would share this with Pepsi in a conversation, in a discussion. I don't think it's so much about them being equal as it is being appropriate to the degree to which the element informs practice. So what is the appropriate weighting that different components would have, number one, relative to each other, and number two, relative to the ultimate outcome, which is we want to understand the person's impact on student learning and practice. So if it's results from student test scores, number one, I mean, there are sort of two fundamental questions I think are important to ask. Whatever it is, I'll use that one as an example. Is it appropriate to that work, that it is helping us to understand the effectiveness of a teacher's practice in terms of student learning? And then what is the appropriate weight to apply to it? What is the appropriate significance to give to it relative to other indicators that we would have in that process? And I would, figuring that weighting, Pepsi has talked about that kind of question with other issues around accountability. It's not, Pepsi would look at a particular indicator and say the indicator itself is important, but we have to wrestle with what's the appropriate weight to give that in an accountability model to understand the effectiveness of whatever the policy might be about. And so I would say as the work continues, and we have further conversations in Pepsi, it's about the appropriateness of the evidence and then the appropriateness of what is the appropriate weight of that evidence. And that to me is about how much does it inform the effectiveness of practice. And then it's part of the integrity of that structure. To me, it's not about them being equal. It's about them being appropriate to what we're trying to do with the evidence, what we're trying to accomplish.
Either way, some decisions would have to be made around that. Thank you.
And ultimately, I think it's important to keep in mind, the purpose of it is, number one, to understand the impact on student learning and to understand how to inform the teacher practice. How do we help practice? How do we elevate practice by understanding that data, what that data is?
Other questions or comments? Superintendent.
Thank you. Dr. Dempsey, having been a part of Pepsi and serving on a subcommittee, I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you took 20 months of work and notes and minutes and condensed it into 14 beautifully written, well-articulated slides. I'm absolutely blown away by the tensions and juxtapositions sections, as well as the design elements, and how you have taken what is something, I mean, we all have been through a system of education that hasn't changed largely for 120 years. And it's something the way that we all both went through education as a student and then either as a teacher and then maybe eventually a principal or a superintendent, or in the case here as a board member, there are things that we take for granted. For example, teacher autonomy. And the way that you have expressed the challenges with the concept of teacher autonomy is just amazing. This is something that I have really appreciated about the current model, the way that it allows for autonomy with support for teachers. It doesn't take away their autonomy, but it asks us to examine this idea that you call autonomous, semi-autonomous, and now I've lost the slide, and sometimes competing entities. The fact that this profession is built on that foundation, which sometimes we just throw our teachers into the lion's den and say sink or swim, because that's how the system is created. And you have put a stake in the ground and said professionals should not enter the profession with full responsibilities without having met expectations for established standards of practice. And when we circle back around to the why of this and put our students in the center of the why, that's what your presentation has done. It has explained to us why we are doing this and how our students are ultimately the beneficiaries of these changes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Superintendent Truitt. I wish my mother was here. She could.
I'll tell you.
My mother's up in Scotland Neck in Halifax County, 89 years old. Every time she sees me, she says, "What does a dean do?" And that's a great answer. I'm going to give that to you.
Tell you you're not a real doctor.
No, she never says that. She always, but she also reminds me of who's the boss when I'm in her presence, so she doesn't care about PhDs and that kind of thing. I do want to add a couple of comments to what you just said, and thank you. One part of the reason that language was accessible and I could bring it into the presentation is the great work that has been done by Pepsi and subcommittees, because the subcommittees were talking about the right questions, the right tensions, the issues that were important. So number one is the language is a synthesis of incredible work across those 4 subcommittees. The second is, I don't know who devised, I probably don't say this as often as I should, someone in the framing of Senate Bill 599 that put together how Pepsi would be constituted in terms of membership did a really good job. Because you have a range of people who are in different educator roles and educator stakeholder roles who bring those tensions in a constructive way to the table in terms of all the work that we do at Pepsi. One that I found most valuable and educative was the tension that I mentioned between schools and school districts. Right now are in a situation where they have to hire people who are not at the level of attainment of the knowledge base that they would like to have. But the reality is they have to make choices around that question. EPPs have a standard of practice that, excuse me, we're held to by, in our case, our accreditor, CAPE. And we can't compromise that standard of practice. But we know those two things create attention when we're looking at what superintendent in the school district needs to do in terms of hiring versus what we think at the university with our partners about how people come to the profession. And the work was not to figure out who was right. The work was to figure out in North Carolina, in the best interest of children in the state and the teaching profession, how to resolve that tension in a constructive way. And the subcommittees produced the work that said it's around this question of autonomy. People can enter the profession with more limited attainment of the knowledge base, but they've got to have the appropriate support to be able to build that professional practice that ultimately moves them toward increasing levels of autonomy in their professional status. And so it's the subcommittees and Pepsi. That's I cheated and summarized what they said. But thank you for the.
Seeing no other comments, I would second everything the superintendent said. Completely agree with her. To those who are seeking the last finite detail, every aspect of this issue, we will disappoint you today. So that's not where we're at. But what you've done a great job, as the superintendent mentioned, is giving us a glimpse into what are the design elements, what are the major conflicts that Pepsi will likely recommend to us next month. And I know you've got another meeting with your team, so this is not final. But we appreciate you giving us this early insight, because I think the question before us is, do we agree with these elements? Do we think these are the elements that our future licensure system should be based on? And is this the way we think that we should support our teachers in order for them to generate even better outcomes for our students? So I think what we're going to do now is break up into small groups to share our individual perspectives among ourselves around what do we think of these design elements, and I would add the blueprint items, because those are very informative as well. What do we agree with? What do we have concerns about? What questions would we have? And then we'll report back to the group as a whole on those insights that we've discussed and we'll go from there. But Dr. Peter,
you did a great job describing that, Chair. The only thing that I would add is that we would love for our local superintendents and our staff to join these groups. We have staff here with us who can answer additional questions that you might have regarding these design elements. And of course, we have Dr. Dempsey here as well. So again, we're going to go through the design elements and specifically looking for what do you really like and what are areas that you have concerns about. There are 8 design elements, and so we'll start with the first 5, which are posted here. Okay.
Are the groups were divided into the same 3 groups that were in the last section?
Actually, we're going to ask you to stay where you're located and break up into groups of 3, no more than 4.
Can we discuss some of our advisors? Or do you think it's
And we also, as I said, need our local superintendents and other staff to join. report out on what they discussed. And we'll go back into our small groups to talk about the blueprint, but we're going to start with the design elements and getting feedback from each group on the design elements. So if you want to stay where you are, that is fine, but we'll start with this group. I'll hand the microphone over. If we could just pass it this way. Yeah. All right.
We have the election.
Yeah. So we had a great discussion. We looked through, we talked through each of the elements, but a lot of our conversation was just concern around teachers and their fear of the changes. They're not being sure what would, say the second one, learner outcomes be about? Is it just that one test score, or are there multiple learner outcomes? And so we just felt like having each of the items, that design elements, we thought they were useful. We thought those were the right things to say. We thought they addressed teacher, the work that teachers do. We felt like the work from teachers is not like any other profession. And so we thought these captured that, but we did that number 2, the learner outcomes, was the one that continued to be a conversation for all of us to say, what are those learner outcomes going to be? How quickly can we share with teachers to say, it's multiple things, not one thing, not the one test score. And we thought that was important to do. But again, making a change, teachers being fearful of what that change might be like for them and for their life. And we thought the sooner we can share and tell them, the better off we'll be. We're going to the next group. Okay.
I think I just got told it was my job. Most of our conversation did center around those learner outcomes as well, and needing to understand and acknowledge that there currently is not a perfect system out there for all teachers. But there are some that EVOS is good. We understand the inherent problems with evaluation data and the variance that comes with that. We understand that student surveys are new and difficult, and we don't. It's kind of an unknown for a lot of people. And we want something else. If there was just that magic wand that would give us the perfect evaluative tool for every teacher, we would be set. That doesn't exist. So I think the more conversation we can have about this issue, understanding what teachers want and need and what makes them feel okay and valued in their practice. I feel that word's been used a lot today. But and relating that practice to a set outcome that they feel good about. Yes, I can hit that, but and that this is what you expect of me, and how you're going to measure that. I think the sooner we can do that for teachers, I think it relieves a lot of anxiety around this.
All right, I'm going to say a few things, and then I welcome anybody else from the group doing this. But we talked about the number of things. One was the importance of support and mentoring, and how that needs to be flexible, and how this court has kind of develops a model for what it could look like with legislation, so taking it from being spelled out by the General Assembly to, for example, have a state board rule that requires each district to develop a plan for mentoring teachers depending on the unique needs of their district. So, but that younger teachers or apprentice teachers will need constant support versus people who have specifically identified needs of support. So that needs to be flexibility in how that support is provided. We talked about pilot programs and the need for piloting some of this. There was a discussion about how those pilots could be unique elements in some districts, or whether or not it should be a district pilot or districts piloting this completely, but that it should go back to Pepsi when we look at a pilot program, and have them develop some recommendations for what a pilot would look like. So then break up those pieces that would go back to Pepsi to help guide the work of the board. That was another thing. And we acknowledged that there was significant investment that is going to be involved, and it will take a number of years to phase in. I think that is that. Okay, thank you. I think that's it. Anything else from my thing? No. What'd you say?
Can't pass it down anywhere else.
Can't pass it.
It stops there.
Now we're going to go through the same process with the blueprint for action, some of which coincide. So if you're looking at two questions, what do you really like about this blueprint? And then what questions do you still have? So there were 10 aspects of the blueprint. Many of you have them opened up on your devices. So as a group, go through the 10, answer those two questions. What do you really like? And what do you still have questions about? That's the next phase.
Maybe we just did the first 5 sign items. We're not going to cover the last 3 in sign.
We moved on to the next 3. I thought this group, I'm sorry.
All right, we did. We were here.
I checked it with the other groups myself, everybody.
Okay, so underneath the sign chart here,
I got it.
what do I like?
The blueprint.
I didn't know. But let's look at the last.
Yeah.
Okay, so 3 of them.
You didn't know that?
Someone says, what are we doing now?
Sorry.
Probably wrapped up.
That's right.
Wow. Tell
We'll start here with Dr. Bridges and go through two here in group three.
Sure. Thank you. So wonderful team. We talked through, we were stuck for a while, and then we got going. But many of these we were really pleased with. There was lots of discussion and questions. So and I'll just maybe shout out a few of them. So number one, we talked about like movement based on meeting expectations and for teachers to have bite sizes. So they could progress, but you don't have 10, 20 things that you need to master in the first licensure area, but you would take bite sizes and be able to move. And we thought that was important to be able to do that. The second one, we talked about multiple points of evidence, and we tied that back to the learner outcomes. We felt like that was a way to make sure, we felt like those were connected, that the multiple evidence points in practice align to the learner outcomes. We hope we're right about that, but that's what we thought. And then number 4, we talked about graduated progression and scaffolding, and that the preparation for teachers needed to be aligned to the progression. That was the other one. And then one of our favorite was number 9. So build and fund a compensation and reward model that reflects the importance of value of the teaching profession and attracts and retains people in the profession. But 1 through 10, we thought, of course, built up to number 9. And we felt like if we were able to see this happen for teachers, of course, it makes sense that number 9 would happen, that pay would increase, we would reward them. We certainly want teachers to stay in the profession. And a sidebar, we had a conversation around teachers who they are not able to pass the exam, but they are impactful in the classroom. And we all had a teacher or teachers that we knew were in the blue with students, but could not pass the exam. And they will shortly, either they have already left the profession or they will be leaving the profession. And we felt like that was a true loss to for our kids and for our school systems. But there are teachers who, I have one who is in the blue every year, and she has not been able to pass the praxis. And that's discouraging.
Dr. Can you just clarify what in the blue means?
Oh, okay, absolutely. I'm sure you need some explanation about this, right? So when we're looking at test scores, the teacher is in the blue. She is outperforming other teachers. Yeah, I think she's a 7th grade ELA teacher. She's outperforming other teachers. She's exceeding growth with her students. She's done it every year. She cannot pass her test.
And her students love her.
And her students love her. She builds great relationships. Her principal has sent me many, many emails, and there is nothing I can do. And Tom has confirmed there's nothing he can do.
You got those emails too.
Yes.
Unless he changes. No. Not you. I'm sorry, not you. We need a change.
Still that person. A lot of the same discussion for us. Just to throw out some different things, we talked early on about the success of advanced teacher roles as a model, and how well that has been working in schools throughout the state, and having some formalized process to have access to that gives a lot of teachers early on the chance to be those blue teachers through the success of other teachers in their building that can guide that work. And then I think one other piece we talked about was the kind of the pathway for teachers to gain those credentials early on through the funding model for professional development, and multiple access points to that to get the things that they need to be a successful teacher and to have that licensure and that credibility.
Stops. We too had a very good conversation. We went back and forth, and though my partners will probably say it was her fault, Olivia's, because we were going back and forth between things we liked and still questions that we have. One of the things that we like is the fact that NTASC is going to be kind of the framework that will hold the pieces together. That gives some credibility to the model. And has some definition in it such that the teacher will know what is expected along that framework. And it would probably require I know it would require some training on the part of principals and mentors and others so that they understand in task. But that's going to be, to me, the piece that will hold it together. We also like the fact that it's visionary. We like the fact that there's a strong presence, definitely a strong presence theoretically, and it will play out, I'm sure. Support, support, support. I have it down 3 times through mentoring, 3 times through mentoring. And we also, we talked about the possibility of piloting in current initiatives. To your point, Patrick, we talked about piloting perhaps in our lab schools around the state, as well as some pilots with the districts that are experimenting with the advanced teaching roles. So there's some real opportunities to move in that direction in terms of experimenting and studying and piloting and learning. It's a big engine. So it just seems like piloting makes a lot of sense. Or piloting some components, several components of it. Anything else, friends? Teacher of the Year?
Is there anything else to this item?
At this point, I think we're going to open it up for additional remarks and comments just about everything that we just.
Just before we do that, we've been joined by our additional superintendents, Dr. Aaron Powell, Lincoln County, and Dr. Aaron Gabriel, Local Road in Newton County. Well, did I miss any other superintendents? All right, great. Well, before we close this particular, will anyone have any other comments about this particular item? What?
Chair, really, builder's perspective, I love we're beginning with this. These are architectural drawings we're working from. We will fuss and fight over them a little bit. We'll tweak them, but we'll come out with a really good product. So, thanks to all the people that you've spent 20 months putting all this together. It's very, very meaningful to me as a board member. I think it means a lot for the teachers and for the kids. So thank you.
Other comments or thoughts? Hearing none, I'll just echo what Mr. Blackburn said. Dean Dempsey, thanks to you and the other members of Pepsi that are here and the entire Pepsi team. You brought us a great set of blueprints. They're incredibly optimistic. That's what we need to be for our teachers and our students. We've got a lot of work ahead of us to turn this into the house we all want to live in, but we're off to a really good start. And we wish you the best in your next Pepsi meeting, and we look forward to connecting with you again in December. Maybe closer to final product. Exactly, considering take action on. Any last comments you'd like to make?
I have one thing similar to the you hear me part of this discussion, sharing what Pepsi done. I would say it's actually not personally typically really but in research, you have this amount of time and you should see 45 minutes. So I ran up at 6 in the last 45 minutes. So I do appreciate your opportunity to work with all of you today to look at language that I believe is reflective of what Pepsi's done over these meetings. And I feel I'm in this person, but I think we're on the front end of something.
We do too. Thank you. Okay. So that closes our last agenda item. Before we close the session, I just wanted to give anyone who would like an opportunity to reflect on the last 2 days. We started with celebrating being here in the Sand Hills. We had a great presentation about how we care for our children, about how we're improving leadership skills among our children, and third was about how to care for teachers. And then today, really great discussion about our vision and where we're going strategically, and then finishing with this discussion about how we better support and improve, retain the fabulous teachers that our students deserve. So anyone have any observations or closing comments before we wrap this up? Ms. Camden?
Just really quickly, in our discussion this morning around the strategic plan, I hope everyone, as I was struck by the alignment between some of those objectives and the work that Dr. Dennis just outlined and that we've been discussing. A lot of the objectives are embedded in this work. So I'm optimistic on both sides.
Any other comments from anyone? Mr. Hall?
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Just want to take the opportunity to reflect back and say how pleased I am that I decided on myself, decided to come to this particular meeting and training. This is my first venture outside of my home since August the 23rd. That's when I had total hip replacement. So I've been at home in my area and whatnot, but something told me that it was time for me to venture. And the drive here is 3 hours and 45 minutes. And I'm so glad I decided to come. Because today has been a real eye-opener when it comes to a lot of myths that's out there, mistruths about licensure, about what we're all about. And to hear my colleagues and others speak on it just get a lot of energy that when I get back home Thursday and Friday, I got some people I'm going to knock on their door. And I'm going to tell them, yeah, what you've been told, what you've been hearing is not the total truth. And I'm serious about that. It's been a good 2 days. It really has been. And to Dave Fleming, thank you so much. Deb, what is it? To the Dean of Education, I thank you for your information, your framework, and also it's one thing that I saw in the blueprint, that there's a possibility, no, it's built in to where teachers want to leave the classroom in order to be compensated for work well done. And that's not merit. But a lot of teachers, good teachers, left the classroom to become administrators because of financial concerns. And a lot of people don't understand it. Don't understand that part of it. But let me do not labor the point, because I know we have other things to do. But it's been a good 2 days. And that's from a person who don't like to sit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're all glad you came, Mr. Hall.
Thank you.
All right, well, a particular thanks to our advisors, superintendent, her staff, who spent these 2 days with us and shared their expertise. Our thanks to the Thomas Entrepreneurship Hub, and could you join me in special thanks for the person who put this all together, and that's Dr. Maria Beach. Thank you. Okay, so everybody else gets to go have a drink, and us board members get to go in closed session. No extra pay for that. So at this point, could I ask for a motion to go into closed?
Yeah. I know everybody wants to stay, so try to give it my best reading. I move that we go into closed session pursuant to North Carolina General Statute, Section 143-318.11, A1, 3, 6, to prevent the disclosure of information that is privileged or confidential pursuant to North Carolina General Statute, Section 115C-321, to consult with our attorneys in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege between the attorneys and the public body, including specifically to consider the cases of OM, by-in through, or legal guardian, CF, versus the North Carolina Innovative School District, and Brian Johnson versus the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and Superintendent of Public Instruction, Catherine Truitt, to consider the qualifications, competence, performance, or condition of appointment of public officers or employees or prospective public officers or employees.
Motion by Vice Chair Duncan, is there a second? Second by Mr. Blackburn, any discussion? Hearing none, Dr. Petrie Clark.
Dr. Oxendine,
Yes.
Mrs. Camnitz.
Yes.
Mr. Keenan, Mr. Hall,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers, Mrs. White, Mr. Blackburn,
Yes.
Mr. Ford, Treasurer Falwell, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes, motion carries. Let's go. How much time? 15 minutes?
15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, how about 3:45?
And closed session